Welcome to Brown Bag History today, May 12th, 2024. Sorry, May 15th, 2024. Put the wrong date on there. Today we're talking about the shooting of a man named Jim at Galena Bay that happened on May 11th, 1894. So 130 years ago this week. And as we start, we acknowledge that the land around Revelstoke and on the Columbia River and its tributaries is the Sinixt homeland and traditional territory. We acknowledge the ties of the Secwepemc, the Okanagan Nation Alliance, and the Ktunaxa to this land. We acknowledge our use and inhabitation of this land sacred to these four nations. We respectfully honor their traditions and culture. So it's a complicated story, and we need to start with a little bit of backstory of the Sinixt people. So Jim, the man who was shot, was referred to in all of the documents as Cultist Jim, but that cultist was a derogatory term. So throughout the talk, I'm going to refer to him as Jim. We don't know his actual name, and we actually I was not able to find a death certificate, even though all deaths were required, even in 1894, were required to have been registered. I can find no record of his death certificate. So there's a lot of things we don't know about him, but we do know that he was Sinixt, and we do know that this was Sinixt territory. This map that I'm showing here is it's called Native Indians, Distribution of Ethnic Groups up to 1850. And the map was produced in 1956. And you'll hear me mentioning later that that was the year that the Sinixt people were declared extinct. So it's a little bit of irony here that they are clearly noted on this map that was produced, that was distributed in 1956 by the provincial government. You can see the darker green here is, or this middle green is interior Salish, and that includes the Shuswap and the Okanagan and several tribes in the United States as well. And you can see this marked line here that goes up into the Big Bend and then sort of follows the Selkirk Mountains. And you can see the border between Canada and the US there. And you can see that their territory falls into the United States as well. And right on the map, it says lakes. That was the designation that was often given to the Sinixt people, was either lakes or Arrow Lakes tribe. But they were definitely on that and on a lot of reports, ethnographer reports, and early exploration reports. They're definitely here. They were definitely, this was their territory. There's recently published a ethnohistorical report on Sinixt traditional territory, prepared by the Ministry of the Attorney General of BC, which was just revised to October 2023. And that's available on Sinixt.com, the website of the Sinixt Confederacy. And I'll show you that website a little later. The report deals with the period between direct European presence in the Arrow Lakes area in 1811 up to the assertion of British sovereignty in 1846 and the creation of the border between Canada and the US, and then also up to the establishment of reserves in the United States. So it refers to, in 1811, the first record of European contact on the Arrow Lakes was when David Thompson and his party of explorers traveled up the Columbia River and through this whole territory. And there's mention of his contact with the indigenous people at that time. There's also a report in 1821 from fur trader Alexander Ross, who met an indigenous man around the Upper Arrow Lake who introduced himself as the chief of what they phonetically spelled Sinixt or Sinixt. And at that time, they were referring to them quite a bit as the Arrow Lakes tribe or the Lakes tribe. This map is reproduced from the book Geography of Memory by Eileen Delahanty Perks, and it shows the Sinixt territory and trails. There was actually a village at Big Eddy that was known as Squeakin. The sketch by the artist Paul Kane, who traveled on the Columbia River in 1846, of a man who's believed to be Chief Gregoire, who he encountered near Downey Creek in 1846. The Sinixt people spoke in Silchin, which is an interior Salish language spoken in different dialects by populations on the Okanagan and Columbia River drainages. The Sinixt people were referred to as hunter-gatherer, but it was more complicated than that. They had what was known as seasonal rounds, where they would travel throughout their territory for fishery, fishing and hunting and gathering berries and other plant materials. But they also practiced resource management using fire to control the berry crops, and there's some evidence of pruning of crops as well. And they would rotate the use of different areas to make sure that they weren't over fishing or over hunting in one area or over gathering in one area over a period of several years. So they were hunter-gatherers, but they actually did practice resource management. Some people are even using the term soft agriculture to refer to their use of the land. This is a photograph that we came across in the City of Vancouver archives, taken in the 1890s. It's just people on the Arrow Lakes. And you can see they have their traditional sturgeon nose canoe, which is the canoe with the long pointed canoes that are traditional with the Sinixt people. This slide is showing this is a current slide from the Confederated Tribes of the Colville Reservation, of which the Sinixt people are part. And it shows the original territory of the lakes and their territory within what became the United States. And you can see that about 80% of their territory or more was in Canada, and about 20% was in the States. And as Shelley Boyd, who's a representative of the Sinixt, often says, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And when the Colville Reservation was created in 1872, after the borders had been set, and so this was now part of Washington State, and they created the Colville Reservation in 1872 and included several different nations on that, as well as the Sinixt. And you can see on here, it has north half of the Colville Reservation. So initially, the border of the reservation went right up to the American-Canadian border. Later on, and so the Sinixt were initially living in that north half of the territory, the Colville Reservation. Later on, excuse me, due to the demands of settlers, that northern part was removed from the reservation. So all of the Sinixt people were moved farther south. So the place where most of the Sinixt people are living now, centered around a village called Inchilum, is actually outside of any of their original territory. So this is kind of setting the stage for what happened. This is a slide that Laura Stovall prepared for a presentation we did before. So by the time that settlement and the coming of the railway happened in this area in the mid-1880s. The Sinixt were still coming up here. This was their territory. This was their traditional fishing and hunting and gathering territory. So they were still coming up here and accessing their land in the traditional ways. And but their rights were not considered valid by the settlers who were here. They were referred to as American or Colville people. And so these were some of the notes that would show up in the newspaper when Sinixt people would show up in the region. November 1890, it said 2 families of Colville Indians who have been camped on McAlpin Island, which is just across the river, have departed in their canoes for downriver hunting grounds. And then in 1892, that should be the local MLA, Pothole Kelly, referred to the destruction of game by Indians from the other side of the boundary line. So it's really, there was really no understanding of the fact that this was their traditional territory. And so the rights were not understood or respected in any way. So there's a manuscript that we have done by a man named Ed Picard, who was in this area in 1887. And he said that in the spring of 1887, they were camped at the mouth of Jordan Creek, just west of Revelstoke, sort of, if you're going up to the landfill. Jordan, of course, the Jordan is just on the way to the landfill. And he mentioned that they were a group of Sinixt people camped in an old railway construction camp on the bank of the river close to town. Said their chief was called Meltur. He referred to him as a young man, well-built, not bad-looking. Said he spoke some English, good Chinook, and another language of their own. Chinook was sort of the language of the fur trade. It was kind of a sort of an accepted language that encompassed some of the indigenous language and English as well. So quite a lot of people did speak Chinook in this area. Picard said that Meltur and some of the other men would come to their camp off and on, and they would go by the Sinixt camp whenever they came to town. And Picard said that he witnessed a sweat ceremony involving Jim, the man that we're talking about today, who was later killed. Said that Jim had been very ill, and they performed a sweat ceremony, and they saw him sort of come out of the sweat and be sort of fully healed from whatever sickness he'd had. At the time that Jim died, he had a wife named Adeline. We'll talk about her quite a bit as well. So the May 19th, 1894 issue of the Kootenai Mail carried this headline: "Killed an Indian. Sam Hill sends a bullet through the heart of cultist Jim." And the article went on to say, "The Columbia River and its tributaries have for generations past been the hunting grounds of a certain tribe of Indians known as the Colville Indians. Colville is in the domain of Uncle Sam, the USA, and these Indians have no right or title to cross the boundary and hunt in British Columbia. But in view of the fact that their forefathers hunted here and looked upon both shores of the Columbia as their own especial preserves, great laxity has always been allowed them, and they hunted for 200 miles up the river from their own reservation at Colville. The camp of this tribe was right here in Revelstoke last summer, and they killed caribou and smaller game all through the closed season, which white men are not allowed to do." And then the article went on to talk about some of the recent preemptions at Galena Bay, where settlers were preempting land in the area. And Samuel Hill applied for preemption of lot 2111 on July 12th, 1893. So this is the area where he had his land and where he was working on the day of May 11th, 1894. The newspaper said, last Friday, May 11th, cultist Jim met an untimely end by attempting to drive one of these men off the land. So on the morning of the 11th, Jim and Adeline came into Galena Bay on the land that Hill had preempted and asked him to leave, saying that they had set bear traps on the area and they didn't want his clearing of the land to interrupt to disturb their trap line. And Sam Hill refused, saying that it was his land. Jim and Adeline laughed and said they would return later. Hill asked two neighbors, Albert Sandin and P.E. Olson, to work on his property with them and be there if Jim returned. And Hill had his rifle with him in the afternoon. So Sandin, Olson, and Hill all reported that around 2 or 3 in the afternoon, Jim and Adeline came around and asked him why he did not leave the land, as he had told him in the morning. Jim said that it was his land and Hill was stealing it. Hill replied that it was his land and asked him to leave and not bother him. Hill said if he had been a good Indian, his words, Hill would have allowed him to hunt on his land. Jim then went up to Adeline, who was standing nearby, and took up the gun. He pulled off the cover, and just as he drew the hammer up, Hill and Jim fired at each other and both missed. Jim began to pull the lever of the gun and ran back towards some elder bushes. Hill fired again, and Jim fell. And Albert Sandin described Sam Hill as not a quarrelsome man. He said, I think he is a nice man. And they also gave pretty much the same account of that, and as did Sam Hill. Hill stated that he left his property immediately after the shooting without checking to see whether Jim was dead. Adeline fled in the canoe that they had there. Sam Hill went to Hall's Landing, where the Justice of the Peace, H.N. Corsier from Revelstoke, was on business there. So Mr. Corsier brought Sam Hill with him up to Revelstoke on the steamer SS Columbia on May 13th, and had Jim's rifle with him as well. Corsier had telegraphed news of the shooting to Coroner Manuel from Donald, and he arrived about midnight Saturday. And then on Sunday, they all went down. Manuel and Corsier and Officer Graham from the provincial police of here at Revelstoke took Sam Hill down with them and went to Hall's Landing, where they picked up 6 men to act as a jury. And then they went to Galena Bay, where they held the inquest right on the beach. And Jim's body was still lying in the field while they were doing the inquest 2 days later. So they got testimony from Albert Sandin and P.E. Olson, and it's pretty much recorded as I mentioned it just earlier. That was the account that they gave. Olson said that and sort of gave a good character witness for Hill as well. So after this jury met on the beach and discussed this and heard the evidence just of the 3 men, they returned a verdict of justifiable homicide. And as far as they were concerned, that it didn't need to go any further. But it was later the Attorney General made the decision that it should be there should be a trial, and summoned Hill for trial. I saw a write-up, just a small write-up in the Victoria Daily Colonist newspaper of May 22nd, and it had just a small write-up about the shooting, and described Mr. Hill as a most industrious man who bore an excellent character, and described Jim as being an Indigenous person from Colville, Washington. So they did summon Hill for a trial, and he came up from Galena Bay on May 29th in response to the summons issued by the Attorney General to take his trial before Revelstoke magistrates for the shooting of Jim. The Constable William Kirkup went down looking for Adeline, for whom a warrant was issued to appear at Revelstoke and give evidence. He was in the cusp looking for her and wasn't able to find her. But when the newspaper was giving this account of trying to get the trial set up in Revelstoke, they repeated the evidence from the earlier witnesses and concluded there's not the least doubt that Hill shot in self-defense. So on June 5th, 1894, the case came before local justices of the peace, H.N. Corsair and Fred Fraser, at the Revelstoke Courthouse, which then would have been just a small building on Front Street. That's before they built the original courthouse on the current courthouse property. Adeline had been found and brought up the previous day on the steamer SS Columbia. She was described in the newspaper as not a bad-looking woman of about 25 and lighter in complexion than what they were called the usual run of Indigenous people. They said the examination was slow work, as she could not get along very fast with her English, and none of those present understood Chinook well enough to question her in that language. So nobody was provided as a translator. So her her testimony was different from that of the three men. She said that on the morning of the shooting, they met Hill on the property at Galena Bay, and Jim said to him, I guess you had better go away for 2 weeks until I quit setting steel traps. Hill refused to go. Jim and Adeline went up the mountain to shoot bear, then came back in the afternoon and saw Hill working in his garden. Adeline said that Jim was carrying a stick in his hand about 3 feet long and 1.5 inches thick, which he planned to use as a seat for the canoe. Jim said, I told you to get away from here. Hill said that he wouldn't do that and that he didn't care for Indians, and then went and got his gun. Jim threw the stick on the ground and asked Adeline for his gun, which she was carrying. She told him not to take the gun because she was afraid he would shoot the white man, but he took it from her. She was sure that he did not cock it. She was standing about 2 feet on his right and 10 feet from the white man. She was close to Jim when the white man fired the first shot. Jim was holding his gun with the muzzle pointing in the air and slanted to the left. After the first shot, Jim started to run behind some trees when the white man fired again. Adeline ran away about 20 feet. Jim ran about the same distance. He was staggering. The white man fired a third shot after Jim had fallen down. They were about 30 feet apart. She was about 30 feet from Jim and 40 feet from the white man when the third shot was fired. One of the other men, a tall man, she said, had a gun which he held in his hands. About 5 minutes elapsed between the first and second shots. Jim did not shoot. The white man fired 3 shots and Jim died. Adeline ran away and returned later to put mitts on Jim's hands and placed an apron over his head. And we don't know what happened to Jim's body. He was still described as lying in the field when they did the inquest on May 13th, but I wasn't able to find any information about what they did with his body, where they took him. And you can hear by that her testimony was very different from the other testimony that was given. So that was early in June. In June 23rd, 1894, the newspaper reported that Samuel Hill was still in custody, waiting for a reply to his request for bail. Said that the case had been heard on June 5th and committed to assizes, which were to be held in Donald on June 15th, but those got delayed until September. The government agent at Revelstoke requested bail for Hill from the Attorney General, but they hadn't received a reply at that time. So the paper was expressing frustration on Hill's behalf, as his ranch was not being looked after. A neighbor had reported that the house had shifted and the roof was gone, and his stuff inside was being ruined by the rain, the wet. And the newspaper went on to say, through somebody's fault, Mr. Hill will not only lose a whole year's work, but also his house and the articles in it. But he was later released on bail later in June with a bond of $500 from him and $500 each from 4 businessmen in Revelstoke. So he was able to get back down to his property. But Adeline was being kept in Revelstoke. We don't know exactly where she was, but she was not allowed to leave. I actually found an article saying that an Italian man had been charged with selling liquor to an Indigenous woman. And mind you, they did not use the term Indigenous woman, but I won't use the word that they used to describe Adeline throughout all of these articles. But they said this man was charged with supplying alcohol to her, and said that she was found drunk and incapable, and the man who sold the liquor was charged and actually sentenced to 3 months in Kamloops jail. So you can imagine what she was having to deal with. Didn't have any support here in town. Was afraid of the people who were people who had killed Jim, and then also just not understanding the process, not speaking English very well. But finally, there was a report in the newspaper that the Kamloops Assizes were to open on Monday, October 1st, before Mr. Justice Wacom, and they would be hearing the case of Samuel Hill. And it did say there that Adeline had been retained in Revelstoke since June and would give evidence. So the grand jury took place on October 1st, 1894, and said they returned a true bill for manslaughter against Samuel Hill, charged with shooting cultist Jim, who was referred to, on May 11th, 1894. Hill initially pleaded guilty, but later said that he did that under a misapprehension. The court permitted him to withdraw the plea and enter a plea of not guilty. And then the newspaper reports, after an able appeal by counsel and an address by the judge, the jury returned a verdict of not guilty without leaving the jury box. Hill was accordingly discharged. Adeline then returned to Revelstoke with Officer Graham, and she left on the SS Lytton on October 5th to join her relatives in the Slocan. So then what happened? Samuel Hill did continue to work on his property in Galena Bay. He eventually went back to County Antrim in Northern Ireland. The property at Galena Bay was listed as abandoned by 1914. But we don't have any further information on Hill. We don't know what happened to him, whether there's some reports saying he got married, some saying he didn't, but we don't really have any solid information on him or when he died. But there's a Hill Creek at Galena Bay that's named after him. And I know when the Sinixt people are asked if they want to see place names changed, that's the one that they'd really like to see changed, because it's named after a person who shot a Sinixt man. And it continued to be an issue for the local settlers. They did not want the Sinixt people coming here at all. There was still, as I mentioned, no understanding of that this was their traditional territory and homeland. So there was a big article in the Kootenai Mail on April 13th, 1895, with the headline, "Dangerous Colvilles. They should be interdicted in British Columbia. American Indians terrorize settlers in the Columbia Valley. What some of the whites say about them. The authorities should act immediately." So it's a very lengthy article and an editorial. It talks about a couple of incidents. A man named Evan Johnson, who'd settled on the northeast arm of the Upper Air Lake near where Beaton is now, 4 years ago. Said a family named Christian claimed the right of the river for trapping and hunting and the land I had taken up, said Evan Johnson. I shot a caribou that swam across the arm, and 4 Indians came and carried it off. And they gave other examples like that and went on to say, we have given the above facts relating to Indian depredations on the Columbia in considerable detail and running through several years, although some of them are not of an aggravated character, in order to show the subtle determination of the Colville people to claim and enforce their claim on the Columbia River Valley against all legitimate white settlers by intimidation and force, which reached a climax in a pitched battle in which a man lost his life at the hands of this man who had the courage to defend his home and rights of property. So they're referring to the Sam Hill case of a year previously. And then an editorial in the same issue was titled Our Indian Troubles. It said the Colvilles are American Indians, and when they commit depredations in Canada, it is very easy for them to escape to their reservation beyond the boundary in the state of Washington. They are under the jurisdiction of the authorities of the United States, and therefore the status of the nomadic marauders on Canadian territory becomes an international question that should be settled between the two governments. They should be made to understand by the United States government that they have no rights to land north of the boundary line. And then they again referred to the Sam Hill case, and that said the settler Samuel Hill owned the land by grant from the provincial government and was rightfully and peaceably improving it as a home, whereas cultist Jim demanded that he should leave because the ringing noises caused by the blows of his civilizing axe frightened away the game from the Indians' traps that were set nearby. So that's the kind of language that was being used, and just making it more and more difficult and dangerous for the Sinixt people to continue to come here. So the Sinixt were declared extinct for purposes of the Indian Act in Canada in 1956. By then, the majority of them were either living on the Colville Reservation or they had intermarried with other nations such as the Secwepemc and the Okanagan Nation and the Ktunaxa. I would really recommend, if you want more information, to visit the Sinixt.com for more information. They have the report that I mentioned that was prepared by the Attorney General of BC is linked. It's linked there. You can read the whole report under the tab that says we've always been here. There's a lot of historical information. So I'd really encourage you to look at that. There's also a tab there under the Desautel decision, and that's referring to a case that eventually made it to the Supreme Court of Canada, and a decision was made 3 years ago in 2021, stating that the Sinixt are Indigenous people of Canada. And it's a very significant decision. There's still a discussion about exactly how that's going to look. The Sinixt have an office in Nelson now. That's the first time they've actually had property in Canada that they're able to do work out of. I was actually able to participate in a training event they had in Nelson a couple of weeks ago, and we were able to hear a lot of information on the ethnohistory report and what steps they're taking now to work with authorities and the provincial government in British Columbia. So it's an ongoing story, an amazing story, and I'd really encourage people to look into it more. A couple of good resources. The Geography of Memory. The first volume of that was written over 20 years ago by Eileen Delahanty Perks, and this is her reprint with additional information in it. But it's a really good grounding of the Sinixt history. And then Swift River by Laura Stovall from Revelstoke, that has a lot of the history of the Columbia River and early exploration and settlement, as well as the history of the Sinixt. So those are two really excellent resources. Those are both available to read here at the museum in our library. We sell Geography of Memory in the gift shop. Swift River, I believe, is sold out or almost sold out now, but we do have a copy here. So I'd like to end this story by talking about Adeline and her life. When you hear the stories of the shooting and the trial, we can only try to read between the lines and just imagine the trauma and the grief that she suffered and the lack of support that she had at that time. She certainly was not treated with any kindness or respect by the people in charge. But she went on to live a very long life. Her son, William Barr, was interviewed in 1986 and talked about Adeline, and said she was born in 1872 in Kettle Falls, which is in Washington, was the southern border of the Sinixt territory. The family was wintering there, and they joined in on the Salmon Festival in June every year. Said every summer and autumn, Adeline, her sister Mary, her mother Pelassus, her father Baptiste, and the rest of the family would head up to the Arrow Lakes, returning to Kettle Falls in the autumn. After Jim's death, Adeline married Celosola, or Louis, who was 20 years her senior. His wife, Louise, had died 2 years earlier, leaving him with 2 children. So he and Adeline had 4 children together, but none of them survived into adulthood. After Celosola died in 1904, Adeline married a white rancher named Barr at Northport, Washington. They had a daughter, Harriet, and sons, William and Joseph. Adeline was a devout Catholic. She loved to go picking huckleberries, and one of their favorite spots was near Red Mountain, near Rossland, which is an amazing huckleberry spot. And it was our family, we used to go there for huckleberry picking as well. So Adeline lived to be 106 years old. She died in 1978. Laura Stovall recently traveled to Spokane to interview Lorraine Wiley, who was one of the great granddaughters of Adeline. Lorraine was 13 years old when Adeline died, so she had many memories of her. She described Adeline as having a soft smile and really bright dark brown eyes. Her hair was always braided, and she always wore a kerchief on her head. Adeline kept her traditional ways. Lorraine's father remembered her singing and pounding her staff on the floor of their home in the middle of a winter night. They would say, "Grandma, please keep it down. We have to go to school in the morning." But she would continue singing all night. They later realized that she was singing her winter dance song, but they didn't know that at the time because of their disconnection with their culture and because the traditional songs and dances had been banned for many years. Lorraine Wiley has led a revival of the Insilchin language in Washington state through the Salish School of Spokane, and says that she was inspired by Adeline to bring their language back. Lorraine said that Adeline was never comfortable speaking English and always preferred to speak in Insilchin. At Adeline's funeral in 1978, Lorraine said that several elderly women were wailing. It was considered their job to do the wailing, to remember her life, and to help people to be respectful and mindful. Lorraine spoke about her connection to Adeline and to the land, and said that she felt a strong connection to Adeline when she visits the Arrow Lakes, and especially when she came to Galena Bay. She said that for all of us who live here now, she would like to see us continue to build connections between us and the Sinixt people, and to understand the land. She sees that as an important part of reconciliation. The land remembers the people who were here, and for us to embody reconciliation, we need to have that knowledge and understanding of the Sinixt who were here before us. So we'll leave that as our talk today. Thank you for coming. I did that right.